Before there was a temple, there was a garden. Before there was a priesthood, there was a man and a woman walking through it in the cool of the day, apparently without fear, apparently without shame, apparently in the kind of proximity to God that every religious tradition since has spent centuries trying to recover. We think we know this story. Most of us encountered it in childhood: the garden, the tree, the serpent, the fall. We learned it as an origin story, the explanation for why everything went wrong. And that framing is not incorrect, but it has caused most people to read past something the text is quietly insisting on. Because before the fall, there was a life, a daily life, rhythms, responsibilities, a relationship between two human beings and the world they inhabited that the Bible describes in surprisingly concrete terms, if you know where to look. And what those details reveal about Adam and Eve's existence in Eden is stranger, richer, and more theologically loaded than anything the Sunday school version ever captured. There is one particular detail about what Adam was actually doing in the garden that almost no one talks about, and it rewrites the entire meaning of what was lost when they left. We will come back to that. But first, we need to hear the version most people already carry. The popular picture of Eden is essentially paradise as vacation. Adam and Eve exist in a lush, frictionless world. Everything is provided. The weather is perfect. The animals are tame. There is no work in the painful sense, no conflict, no lack. They walk with God in the evenings, eat freely from an abundant garden, and live in a state of unbroken bliss, right up until the moment the serpent appears and ruins everything. This is the version most people hold, and to be fair, it draws on real elements of the text. Genesis 2 does describe abundance. It does describe intimacy with God. It does describe a world without shame, without fear, without the grinding weight that characterizes human experience after chapter 3. But this version has quietly edited out something the text states plainly, in the very passage most people think they know. And that omission changes everything about what Eden actually was. Genesis 2:15 is one of the most casually read verses in the entire Bible. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Two words in that verse have been carrying a theological freight that most English readers never feel. The Hebrew words are abed and shamar, work and keep, in most translations. But that rendering is accurate without being complete. And the gap between accurate and complete is where the real meaning lives. Abad, translated as work or till, is the standard Hebrew word for labor, but it is also the word used throughout the Old Testament for service, specifically priestly and Levitical service. It is the word used in Numbers 3:7-8 to describe what the Levites were to do in the tabernacle. They were to abad, to serve, to minister, to tend. Shamar, translated as keep, is equally layered. It carries the sense of guarding, protecting, watching over. It is the word used for the cherubim stationed at the entrance of Eden after the expulsion. The same word now applied to angels standing guard over sacred space. What this means is that Adam's role in the garden was not gardening in any ordinary sense. The language the text uses to describe his daily work is the language it will later use for priests in the sanctuary. Adam was not a farmer, he was a priest. And Eden was not a park, it was a temple. This is not a fringe interpretation. Scholars including Greg Beale, John Walton, and G.K. Beale have written extensively on the temple garden parallel in Genesis, and the convergence of evidence is difficult to dismiss. Consider the structure. Ancient Near Eastern temples were consistently designed to evoke and replicate a garden cosmos. They featured tree imagery, flowing water, carved animals, and golden ornamentation meant to symbolize the abundance of creation. The innermost room, the Holy of Holies, was understood as the dwelling place of the deity, the point where heaven and earth touched. Eden fits every marker. A river flows from it and divides into four, a symbol of the life-giving presence of God, radiating outward into the whole earth. Gold and precious stones are mentioned by name. The tree of life stands at its center, and God Himself walks in it, using the same Hebrew verb, mithalik, used later to describe God's presence moving through the tabernacle. The garden was not just a beautiful place to live, it was the original sanctuary. The first space where heaven and earth were not two separate realities, but one. And Adam's daily life was the daily life of a priest tending holy ground. What did that actually look like in practice? The text does not give us a schedule, but it gives us enough to reconstruct the shape of it. Adam named the animals. This act, which we often read as a charming episode, was in the ancient world a profound act of ordering and authority. To name something was to understand its nature, to assign it its place within a structure. The scribal traditions of Mesopotamia preserved lists of animals, plants, and stars that served exactly this function, to catalog creation as an act of sacred knowledge. Adam's naming was not an afternoon activity. It was an act of priestly cognition, perceiving, categorizing, and stewarding the created order as an act of worship. He tended the garden, and as we have seen, the language of that tending was the language of sacred service. Every act of cultivation, of care, of watchful presence in that space was, in some sense, a liturgical act. Not because of ritual performance, but because of location and relationship. When you are tending the dwelling place of God, ordinary work becomes something else entirely. And he walked with God. The text does not elaborate on what those encounters looked like, but the casualness of the verb is itself a statement. There was no ceremony required to access God's presence, no sacrificial system, no intermediary, no veil. The distance that would later define Israel's entire religious architecture, the distance between the holy and the human, had not yet opened. Pause there for a moment, because that is the detail that carries the most weight. Adam and Eve did not live in a world where God was far away and occasionally accessible. They lived in a world where proximity to God was the baseline condition of daily life. Their ordinary Tuesday was what Israel's high priest experienced once a year on the Day of Atonement, if everything went correctly and he survived. That is what was lost. Now consider Eve within this picture, because the text places her inside it with equal intentionality. Genesis 2:18 introduces her with a phrase that is almost always translated too softly. God says it is not good for the man to be alone, and he will make for him an ezer kenegdo. Most translations render this as helper or helpmeet, but ezer is not a subordinate term in Hebrew. It is a term of powerful, active assistance. And in every other place it appears in the Old Testament outside of Genesis, it refers either to military aid or to God Himself. Psalm 121 verse 2. My help comes from the Lord. The word is ezer. Psalm 146 verse 5. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob. Ezer again. The word used to describe Eve's role in Eden is the same word used to describe what God does when He rescues Israel in battle. It is a word of strength, not subordination. A word of active, indispensable participation. Eve was not an afterthought to the Eden arrangement. She was a co-bearer of the priestly vocation, equally implicated in the tending, the naming, the guarding, the walking with God that constituted daily life in the garden. The image of Eden the text actually gives us is not one person doing sacred work while another keeps house. It is two image bearers together, functioning as the caretakers of God's earthly sanctuary. When you hold all of this together, the priestly language of Adam's calling, the temple architecture of the garden itself, the strength embedded in Eve's designation, and the unmediated access to God that defined their daily existence, what emerges is not simply a lost paradise. It is a lost vocation. What Adam and Eve walked away from, or were expelled from, was not just a comfortable life. It was a sacred office, a daily participation in the maintenance of the space where heaven and earth met, a relationship with God so immediate that the entire sacrificial and priestly system that follows in the Old Testament can be read as one long, elaborate attempt to rebuild access to what was simply Tuesday in Eden. The central insight of their daily life is this: human beings were not created for distance from God. They were created for residency with Him. The longing that drives every religious impulse, the reaching, the ritual, the prayer, the hunger for something more, is not the invention of religion. It is the memory of Eden encoded in human nature. We are not reaching for something we have never had. We are reaching for something we lost. That realization does something to the way you read the rest of the Bible. Every tabernacle, every temple, every priestly code, every sacrifice. They are not arbitrary religious systems. They are the long story of God rebuilding what the garden was. And the New Testament's claim that the veil of the temple was torn at the crucifixion is not a minor liturgical detail. It is the announcement that the distance has been collapsed, that the baseline condition of Eden, unmediated proximity to God, is being restored. You were not made for occasional access. You were made for daily residency.